Asylums in the early 1900s were meant to simply be a place of rest. Treatment of mental illness was in its infancy and involved mainly fresh air and sunlight, or treatment of blood-borne disease. State Lunatic Asylum No. 2 was no exception to this. Women were one of the highest populations in our asylum at that time, mainly due to the ease at which women could be admitted and how difficult it was as a woman to be released from an institution. Reasons to admit a woman to the asylum at that time included things like worrying too much for your children, failure to complete your housework, promiscuity. The list was rather extensive. Prior to the 1930s, across the United States, if you were admitted to an asylum by your spouse, the only way to be released was by having a male family member or your spouse come back to get you. Most states, including Missouri, would grant the husband a divorce, not easy to get at that time, if their spouse spent more than 1 year in an asylum, so it was beneficial to those men who were unhappy in their marriage. Most patients, especially women, lived their entire lives here. It was commonplace to ask, what clothes do you want them buried in, when a new patient arrived, because most likely they would never go home. Patients would not necessarily be sent to institutions to get well. There were few forms of treatment, and most did not work. They would be placed in the hospital as a means of separating them from society. By the mid-1940s, No. 2 was at its largest, and housed not only mental health patients, but also patients with tuberculosis, dementia, syphilis, alcohol and drug abuse issues, as well as people who were simply handicapped. It became a place for all of those in society that were basically unwanted by their family and peers. Large asylums were normally built outside of town. No. 2 was about 2.5 miles outside of town. The hospitals were their own community, with farms, carpentry shops, metal shops, sewing rooms, and their own cemeteries. These were all worked by the patients. Due to drastic lack of state funds for these institutions, it made it difficult to care for the abundance of patients. No. 2 had over 3,000 patients in care at its peak. This was prior to modern insurances or patients' rights laws, so these large asylums relied on the labor of the patients to provide the basic goods and services needed to run the hospital. Patient labor provided the hospital not only with what was needed to care for the patients, but also a means to sell excess items for profit, to pay the wages for the nurses and the doctors. Using practices that we now call occupational therapy, these self-sustaining hospitals were in place until the early 1960s. The farms, though traditionally worked by male patients, provided all the food that would be consumed at the hospital. By harvest time, it was all hands on deck, and the processing of crops, canning, and preservation would have been performed by all the patients. No. 2 had 3 farms, a vegetable farm and orchard on the grounds of the hospital, an award-winning dairy farm that was located where Missouri Western State University is now, and an animal and slaughter farm that was in Andrew County, Missouri. Though the farms were a large operation at the hospital, they were not the only one. Female patients would take on a variety of different tasks that were geared more as women's work. These tasks could include working in the kitchen, housekeeping, sewing rooms, or gardening activities. The labor position served a dual purpose for the patients. Not only did it provide care for the patients, it also gave them a sense of purpose and kept them busy. Most of these positions were outside and provided ample sunshine and fresh air as well. Unfortunately, for some patients, this was the biggest part of their treatment. Treatment prior to modern medication ran the gamut from blood-borne illness treatment to experimental surgeries. In the early 1900s, much of the treatment involved bloodletting, leaching, burning and blistering of the skin. With success in physical health treatment, the thought process was that these treatments would work for mental illness as well. However, few patients got any relief from these, and most ended up with worsening mental conditions due to the trauma of the treatment itself. Not seeing results from the current options, doctors began to explore other methods, including more controversial treatments than originally performed. Some of those treatments included hydrotherapy, insulin therapy, electroshock therapy, restraints, seclusion therapy, trepanation, and lobotomies. Insulin therapy would involve injecting a non-diabetic patient with insulin or metrazole to send the body into convulsions. It was thought that these epileptic-type seizures would essentially rewire the brain, and it could heal. This was where electroshock therapy was derived from. Developed in the late 1930s, the first treatments were not given to patients until 1941. The purpose was to cause a seizure of the body by sending an electric current through the brain. Psychiatrists, having already seen success of this type of seizure therapy for mania and extreme depression, saw this as the next logical step without having to introduce chemicals into the body. Unfortunately, voltages, time frames, and pain medications were not considered in the infancy of electroconvulsive therapy. ECT became more of a punishment than a treatment and was used in a threatening manner in some hospitals. Women in particular would be given ECT for hysteria and depression, both considered a woman's disease at this time. ECT has undergone a lot of research and is currently still used as a mental health treatment. Seclusion rooms at number 2 had a dire effect on the patients. In the early 1900s, seclusion rooms in mental health would have been sensory deprivation. No light, no sound, no contact. This form of therapy was used to eliminate overstimulation of the brain and was meant to have a calming effect. Today we know that this type of deprivation has a detrimental effect on the brain and can cause mental illness rather than treat it. Lobotomy was developed in 1935 by Egos Moniz. It basically destroys the tissue of the frontal lobe and is meant to change the personality of the patient, thus curing their mental illness. Moniz was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1949 for the invention of the lobotomy. In 1945, Walter Freeman perfected the lobotomy with the modification to the transorbital or ice pick lobotomy. Meant to cure all people with severe mental illness, they performed more than 40,000 in the U.S. alone. It was a desperate attempt to deal with the overcrowded and underfunded hospitals. St. Joseph's No. 2 was a teaching hospital for lobotomy in the late 1940s. The overcrowding of these large institutions became a major concern not only for the state government, but also the employees and patients. No. 2 was no exception to this. Dorm-style housing was introduced in the 1930s and grew beyond measure over the next decade. Experimental treatments were tried for almost every mental illness, with the hope that something would work and patients could go home. Women suffered the most from these experimental trials. Prior to the 1960s, there was no such thing as patients' rights laws, and for women, they came much later than that. So a lot of these trials would be done without patient consent. What about the family's knowledge, you might ask? From the inception of large asylums in the U.S., it was considered extremely taboo to have your family name associated with mental illness. Unfortunately, this made the population of these asylums grow even more. Families would drop off their loved ones, sometimes even under an assumed name, and would never return to visit or pick up their family member from the asylum. So the choices for care were in the hands of the doctors and nurses. After a patient had passed away, their bodies were still unlikely to be claimed. There is a cemetery on the grounds of the former State Hospital No. 2, now part of the Department of Corrections, and it is believed that Katherine Majors is buried there. We would have no way to be able to tell what grave is hers, however. Grave markers in the cemetery were simply a number, and they go up over 2,000. We will probably never know who everyone buried here is. Because of the stigma against mental illness at that time, it was done this way to make sure that future generations wouldn't know that their family member had died in a mental institution. Most of the headstones in that cemetery were also sheared off in the 1970s to make it easier to mow. Thousands of lost souls now reside here in unmarked graves. Katherine Majors may be one of them. For women in the early 1900s, asylum life was full of trials and tribulations. For most patients of that time, however, the hospital became their home, their family, their friends, and their entire life. Regardless of the stigma surrounding mental health, the taboo and discredited treatment practices, or the ease to which women could be admitted, many women made the most of their time in these institutions, and they lived as full of lives as they could.